Hello! In this video, I will be reading a selection of works by Leslie Cross, who was instrumental in the process of defining veganism. He worked closely with Donald Watson, who coined the term vegan and founded the Vegan Society in the 1940s. This video includes Veganism Defined, which was published in the magazine World Forum in 1951, and 3 works published in The Vegan, including The New Constitution, also from 1951, The Surge of Freedom from 1954, and The Vegan Story from 1955, all by Leslie Cross. Digitized versions of the referenced issues of The Vegan will all be linked in the description of the video, as well as the website A Candid Hominid, where all of these works and more can be found in PDF format. Veganism Defined by Leslie J. Cross, 1951. Recently, the Vegan Society adopted revised and extended rules which, among other things, clarify the goal towards which the movement aspires. The Society's object and meaning of the word veganism have until now been matters of inference and personal predilection, are now defined as follows. The object of the Society shall be to end the exploitation of animals by man, and the word veganism shall mean the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals. The Society pledges itself, in pursuance of its object, to seek and end the use of animals by man for food, commodities, work, hunting, vivisection, and all other uses involving the exploitation of animal life by man. Membership to the Society is available to all who wish to see the object achieved and who undertake to live as closely to the ideal as personal circumstances permit. An associate makes no promise as to behavior but declares himself in agreement with the object. The door is thus widely opened, and the Society welcomes all who feel able to support it. Direction and management of the Society's work, however, rest with the members. The effect of this development is to make veganism unique among movements concerned with animal welfare, for it has crystallized as a whole and not, as are all other such movements, as an abstraction. Where every other movement deals with a segment, and therefore deals directly with practices rather than with principles, veganism is itself a principle, from which certain practices logically flow. If, for example, the vegan principle is applied to diet, it can at once be seen why it must be vegetarian in the strictest sense and why it cannot contain any foods derived from animals. One may become a vegetarian for a variety of reasons: humanitarian, health, or mere preference for such a diet. The principle is a matter of personal feeling, and varies accordingly. Veganism, however, is a principle that man has no right to exploit the creatures for his own ends, and no variation occurs. Vegan diet is therefore derived entirely from fruits, nuts, vegetables, grains, and other wholesome non-animal products, and excludes flesh, fish, fowl, eggs, honey, and animal milk and its derivatives. In a vegan world, the creatures would be reintegrated within the balance and sanity of nature as she is in herself. A great and historic wrong, whose effect upon the course of evolution must have been stupendous, would be righted. The idea that his fellow creatures might be used by man for self-interested purposes would be so alien to human thought as to be almost unthinkable. In this light, veganism is not so much welfare as liberation, for the creatures and for the mind and heart of man, not so much an effort to make the present relationship bearable, as an uncompromising recognition that because it is in the main one of master and slave, it has to be abolished before something better and finer can be built. Veganism is in truth an affirmation that where love is, exploitation vanishes. It possesses historical continuity with the movement that set free the human slaves. Were it put into effect, every basic wrong done to animals by man would automatically disappear. At its heart is the healing power of compassion, the highest expression of love of which man is capable. For it is a giving without hope of a getting. And yet, because he would free himself from many of the demands made by his lower nature, the benefit to man himself would be incalculable. Leslie Cross, Vice President, Vegan Society, 39 Willow Crescent East, Uxbridge, Middlesex. The New Constitution by Leslie J. Cross, from the spring 1951 issue of The Vegan. Enclosed with each copy of this issue of The Vegan sent to members is a copy of the new rules, with a form to be filled in and posted to the new secretary, Mrs. Hilda Honeysett, 38 Stane Way, Ewell, Surrey. This article is intended to explain the more important points about the new rules which the Vegan Society adopted at a special general meeting in London on November 11, 1950. We have to remember that when the society was founded in 1944, there were no rules, and that this position remained until March 1947, when rules were adopted which have served until now. For some time, however, it has been apparent that as veganism developed, the first set of rules became less capable of providing the society with a wise and logical constitution. The great difference between the old and the new rules is that this inability has been made good. Our rules are not mere regulations, nor are they simply an outline of our working arrangements. Of course, they are regulations, and they do describe the kind of machinery we have agreed upon, but they do much more. They enshrine and safeguard our ideals. They state precisely and with corporate authority of the society behind them, the ultimate goal to which we aspire. Lack of such a statement was the most serious deficiency of the earlier rules, though it has to be remembered that when they were adopted, the society had not evolved to the point at which we could agree upon our ultimate aim. By stating our agreed goal, and by defining the word veganism officially, we have found a permanent common, and brought to an end the dangerous and ever-present possibility of disintegration. The object of the vegan movement, to end the exploitation of animals by man, is clarified as to the meaning of exploitation by Rule 4a, which pledges the society to seek to end the use of animals by man for food, commodities, work, hunting, vivisection, and all other uses involving exploitation of animal life by man. By the adoption of this rule, the society has clearly come out on the side of the liberators. It is not so much welfare that we seek as freedom. Our aim is not to make the present relationship between man and animal, which if honestly viewed is mostly one of master and slave, more tolerable, but to abolish it and replace it with something more worthy of man's high estate. In short, our aim is to set the creatures free, to return them to the balance and sanity of nature, which is their rightful place, and so to end the historic wrong perpetrated when man first decided he had the right to exploit and enslave them. The second broad aspect of the vegan aim is its effect upon human evolution. Apart from the abolition of an enormous burden of cruelty which is bound constantly to return like a boomerang upon humanity's own head, it has to be remembered that in any relationship of master and slave, the greatest and deepest harm is suffered not by the slave but by the master. Until the present relationship between man and his fellow creatures is replaced by one of companionship on a relatively equal footing, the pursuit of happiness by man is foredoomed to a painful and tragic frustration. These are the broadest effects of the new Constitution, but there are other aspects which should perhaps be touched upon. It is now possible to join the society either as a full member or as an associate, and the committee asks each existing member to state in which category he or she wishes to be. It may therefore be helpful to point out that the new rules define a member as one who undertakes to live out the vegan principles as far as he or she is able according to circumstances. In other words, what is required is one's honest best. And honest in this context means reasonable also. No one should deny themselves the benefits of full membership simply because circumstances preclude as great a degree of consistency as might otherwise be desired. The great thing is to be vegan in spirit, and then do one's best. An associate is one who is with us in principle, but who wishes to give no kind of undertaking as to practice. The line of demarcation is, therefore, not rigid consistency, but endeavor. The annual subscription has been raised to 7s6d, and life membership to 7 guineas. The committee has decided that the annual subscription shall in future cover the period January 1st to December 31st, and shall become payable on January 1st each year. One other important operation performed by the new rules is an increase in the unity of the movement by making it possible for the London Vegan Group to end its separate existence and become a branch of the society. Constitutionally, the London Vegan Group is older than that of the Vegan Society and is an organization in its own right. By allowing for the setting up of branches of the society, the new rules clear the way for the London Vegan Group to integrate itself into a united movement. It is perhaps not too much to claim for the new Constitution that it marks the true birth of the Vegan Society. It should be read and understood by all those who contemplate joining us, for there, enshrined and embedded in words which are necessarily formal, lies all that we stand for and hope one glorious day to achieve. Leslie J. Cross. The Surge of Freedom by Leslie J. Cross, from the 10th anniversary edition of The Vegan, Winter 1954. This is an attempt to state in simple terms what veganism is, and why and how it came into existence, and to suggest what it could mean for mankind. The word veganism is a symbol that stands for major change, a new mutation comparable to the freeing of the serfs and the freeing of the slaves. Its official definition, the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals, is accurate, precise, and comprehensive, but not always fully understood. This is not as surprising as it might seem, for rarely have 9 short words enshrined a reform so massive, the achievement of which would bring a new world and new men to inhabit it. Why do we believe we should live without exploiting animals? To put the question in another form, why was such a doctrine formulated? The final, if not the immediate answer, is a revealing one, for it demonstrates the truth of the claim that veganism is not a mere side shoot in human evolution, but a central extending growth of considerable significance. Veganism owes its birth to the fact that at the deepest point within us, we believe impregnably in freedom, particularly, perhaps, those who are born and bred in these traditionally freedom-loving islands. Freedom to live our own lives in our way according to our own inward light is fundamental to our view of life itself. It is in the light of this concept that we find the true significance of the vegan reform. Only when we see it as a doctrine not of restriction, as those who oppose it mistakenly believe, but of freedom, do we fully comprehend it. The simple fact is this, that at rock bottom, veganism is the most recent of the periodic surges which have marked the tide of freedom ever since history began. It is distinguished from its predecessors by virtue of the fact that it brings quite a new and distinctive feature into the long fight for liberty. It has driven the tide of freedom beyond what has hitherto been held to be its natural boundary, the concept of the free man. Until the advent of veganism, comparatively few men regarded the animals as being either worthy of or entitled to the right to be free, and probably fewer still realized the impressive effect which the granting of such a right would have upon the freedom of man himself. The real, indelible significance of veganism is its devastatingly logical demonstration that by denying to the animals the right to be free, man keeps locked against himself the gateway to his own further pursuit of happiness. To believe in the right to be free means inevitably that we grant the same right to others. If we fail in this, we deny the principle itself. We thus make of Orwell's 1984 a logical possibility, and the slavery of one man to another a justifiable act. To put it another way, the law of freedom, which is also the law of love, knows no limits, because in his mind, man has excluded the animals from its operation. He has set arbitrary limits upon it, and in so doing has reaped what he has sown, a severe limitation upon his own progress. It is upon this factor, this little recognized bar to the upward growth of man, that veganism throws such a ruthless and revealing light. When we turn to the question of how veganism came into the world, we find an excellent example of the indirect approach which the forces of destiny sometimes adopt. The mundane fact is that the seed of veganism grew out of a year's argument in the correspondence columns of the Vegetarian Messenger about the moral case against the use of dairy products by vegetarians. At the end of the correspondence, a handful of vegetarians decided they would like to form themselves a non-dairy group within the Vegetarian Society. But the society declined and suggested that these few members should set up an organization of their own. Thus was the Vegetarian Society the unwitting handmaid of destiny, for the direct result of its action was the formation of the Vegan Society in November 1944. The new society was not long content with merely being non-flesh, non-dairy, non-egg, non-honey. Commodities such as fur, leather, and wool joined animal food as being non-vegan. There was an early attempt to get at the root of what is wrong with the relationship between man and the animals, to deal with the cause rather than its almost uncountable effects. However, not without some years of internal stress and strain was the society able to be precise about what it wanted to do. It made up its mind finally on November 11, 1950, when it agreed in a special general meeting that what it wanted to do was end the exploitation of animals by man. Between 1944 and 1950, the inner and true meaning of veganism was held in solution, undefined and incompletely recognized. The non-dairy motivation was from the start clearly insufficient as a final meaning. It was in fact no more than the trigger movement that impelled a new and profound truth into the world. In 1950, when the meaning of veganism became generally apparent, it was formulated into a simple phrase which was inserted into the society's constitution. Since 1950, there has been no doubt as to its meaning. The short definition quoted in the early part of the article is amplified by Rule 4a. The society shall seek to end the use of animals by man for food, commodities, work, hunting, vivisection, and all other uses involving exploitation of animal life by man. Although prior to 1950, there was a good deal of argument as to what veganism in fact was, one thing was never in doubt. The impelling power behind the movement was, and remains, compassion for the animals arising out of their treatment at the hands of man. It was compassion that led the first handful to band together in 1944, and it is compassion that provides the motive power today. As a society, an important part of our work is to bring the notice of men everywhere to something which might otherwise escape their attention: the all-round importance of animal emancipation. Animals present man with the supreme test of his worthiness and ability to advance, the test of how he behaves towards those over whom he possesses power. It is sad but true that in the face of this test, more often than not, he seeks his own ends at the cost of suffering to the animals. He hunts, slaughters, vivisects, and enslaves them. To obtain their milk, he inflicts upon them some of the least worthy of all his exploitations: the deliberate and forcible separation of mother cow from baby calf. He takes the wild, free, and noble horse, breaks, castrates, and harnesses it. His constant prayer is not so much for daily bread as for daily flesh. The compassionate man may well be excused for asking pointedly what kind of relationship this can be, that has for its symbols the whip and the bit and the slaughterer's knife. The American writer Henry Bailey Stevens has argued that one of the wrong turnings taken by man somewhere in his evolution was the enslavement, domestication, of animals. The contention is to say the least logical. There is not much common sense, for example, in asking for peace on Earth and at the same time prosecuting what amounts to war upon the animals. What is needed to begin with to correct this evolutionary deviation is an acceptance of the idea that animal emancipation is a desirable aim. If a sufficient number of people experienced such a mental conversion, then the skills and ingenuity of man could be used to develop alternatives to those products of animal origin which the majority of men undoubtedly believe to be essential to their well-being. These products, a completely satisfactory non-animal milk is an example, are necessary if the universal practical application of the ideal is to be achieved. For men and women are not all alike, and there are many of us for whom the practical obstacles must at present seem insurmountable. We cannot shut our eyes to the undoubted fact that to such people, such obstacles are real and not imaginary. In order to provide the vegan movement with sufficient resources and skill, it is vital to attract people to it. The most immediate method is the spreading of the idea of animal emancipation. We shall welcome converts of whatever degree, those who can promise no more than mental acceptance equally with those who faithfully and so far as they are able put their acceptance of the ideal into daily practice. As the idea becomes more and more accepted, opportunities will grow to make the path easier and more attractive for those whose nature is not that of the pioneer. Concurrent with the gradual removal of obstacles to the personal practice, attention will have to be given to the question of how we propose to deal with animals in general as soon as the changeover from exploitation to freedom reaches a certain stage. It is not difficult to see that such a changeover will bring with it problems of a wide and general character. No one, least of all the vegan, wants a world without animals, and how in general and in detail we propose to effect the swingover from exploitation and the perversion to freedom and naturalness will be quite a talking point one fine day. If I may intrude a personal observation, there is little more desirable I would ask of Providence than that such a day should dawn while I am still here to experience it. How glorious, for example, to take part in a discussion to decide whether, for the purposes of the changeover, a nature park or an animal sanctuary should be set up in this or that part of the country, and exactly how it should be planned. When veganism reaches such a stage, there will have been an immense change of heart and mind in the majority of men and women. The idea of exploiting animals will be as repugnant then as the idea of human slavery is today. Some of the changes in daily living are obvious. There will be, for example, no butcher's shops, and the milkman, if he still goes his rounds, will be delivering vegan milk. The countryside will not be heavy with the anguish of cows crying for their calves. There will be no slaughterhouses, no vivisection laboratories. No one will hunt animals for fun. But some of the changes are not so obvious. The benefits to man himself of living in a kindlier and more enlightened world can be envisaged only in broadest outline. His health, physical and mental, will be vastly improved, because he will have shed a great deal of the coarser part of his nature. Benefits of the spirit will shower upon him. benefits which today, by his own short-sighted volition, he denies himself. Such is the stuff of dreams. To make them true requires that we play our part as it comes to us. We are in the very elementary states of the new mutation. We are the pioneers. The Vegan Story by Leslie J. Cross, from the winter 1955 issue of The Vegan, a talk given to the Hastings and St. Leonard's branch of the Sussex Vegetarian Society, July 1955. The first thing I would like to do is draw your attention to the title of this talk, The Vegan Story. I have called it that because I wanted to underline the manner in which I am going to try to approach the subject. What I am hoping to do is just what the title suggests, to tell a story, the story of what veganism is, what it sets out to do, and why it sets out to do what it does. In the course of the story, I shall put before you certain facts and certain considerations, but I shall not, at least not consciously, try either to convert anyone or to conduct any propaganda. Just in case there may be some of you who feel that this is perhaps a somewhat spiritless approach, I would like to explain that to my way of thinking, it is the right approach. For while I regard the spread of information, the free flow of information, as being vital to the growth of new ideas, I do not regard it as any part of my duty to try to be consciously persuasive. I think you will probably agree with me that man should settle upon his way of life as the result of inward conviction, not as the result of outward persuasive pressure. With that preamble, let us begin the vegan story. And in doing so, we must put first things first. That is, we must know what we are talking about. Fortunately, the word veganism has a precise and simple meaning. It means the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals. Because the question of definition is so obviously an important one, I'm going to ask you to be kind enough to commit it to memory, so that when we use the word veganism, we shall all be thinking of the same thing. Veganism, then, is the doctrine that man should live without exploiting animals. This definition is written in exactly those words in the Constitution of the Vegan Society, so that no one joins the society as either a full member or an associate without knowing exactly what he is supporting. It is important to notice that one of the results of this definition is that it makes veganism a principle. It is, of course, a principle from which certain practices naturally flow, but it is in itself a principle and not a set of practices. A further point to notice is that this principle, this doctrine, is concerned with one matter only. A big matter, it is true, but a clearly defined one. The matter of the right relationship between man and the animals. What it says in effect is this. It says that the relationship generally accepted by the world at large is a very imperfect one. It says in effect that we shall not do away with the many wrongs done to animals, nor shall we do away with the harm which results to the soul of man until we alter that relationship. It is necessary, therefore, to look at the present relationship between man and the animals and to ask what is wrong with it. What is wrong, according to veganism, may be summarized into one word: exploitation. If we look clearly and simply at this relationship, we can see that it is almost entirely, not quite, but almost entirely, based from man's side of the fence upon the idea that he has a moral right to use animals for his own purposes. Again, if we look clearly at this question of relationship, we can also see that, broadly speaking, there are two ways in which we may regard the animals. 1, as creatures to exploit, 2, as creatures to love. If we want to understand veganism, if we want to assess its value, we are bound to examine, at least briefly, these two broad views of the relationship between man and the animals. First, let us look at the majority view, the view that animals are here for our use, that we have a moral right to use them for our own ends, provided that we reduce hardship and suffering to the minimum compatible with what we require of them. This view is held by the majority of people quite automatically. For example, farmers talk quite casually about growing more bacon, just as you or I might talk about growing more cabbages. Again, the majority view is that we have the moral right to use animals for labor. To the majority view, there is no fundamental questioning of our right to harness horses, bullocks, camels, and so on, to make them work to our orders and our requirements. In practice, of course, there are considerable variations in the manner in which men do in fact use animals. These variations stretch from the comparatively harmless to the downright cruel. But the important thing is, it seems to me, is to notice the direction in which the doctrine of exploitation takes us. If we wish to illustrate this direction, we may quote vivisection perhaps, or the fact that work in slaughterhouses often blunts the finer feelings of the men who work there. Another point we are bound to notice is that there are some exploitations in which suffering to animals is inherent. That is to say, if we abolished the suffering, we would automatically abolish that particular form of exploitation. Once again, vivisection is an obvious example. Another is dairy farming, particularly because of the necessity of separating the baby calf from its mother. It is hardly possible to escape the conclusion that when man decided he had a moral right to exploit animals, he quite inevitably opened the door to a new and man-made form of suffering, much of which ends only in one form of slaughterhouse or another. There is, however, yet another aspect which arises from this question of exploitation, and it is an aspect which by no means receives the attention it deserves. I refer to the aspect by which man harms himself. When there is an interaction between two or more entities, the effects of the interaction are not confined to one entity only, but each is in some way affected. What, then, is the effect upon man of the interaction which he has created between himself and the animals? The effect upon man cannot differ as to its essential nature from the nature of the interaction itself. That is perhaps a rather complicated way of saying something which was said much more simply long, long ago. As we sow, we reap. What do we sow? What do we do to the animals? We breed them in millions in order to slaughter them for food. We exploit their sex functions in order to make them yield milk. We then take the baby calf from its mother so that we, and not it, may have the milk. Often we then kill the baby calf and we eat it as veal. When the mother is worn out as a result of one unnatural pregnancy after another, we kill her too and eat her as beef. We hunt animals for fun. We vivisect them. We castrate and harness them. What kind of relationship can it be whose symbols include the whip and the bit and the harness and the slaughterer's knife? If these are the things we sow, then those too are the things we reap. The form in which our harvest comes to us outwardly may be seen in some of our diseases and in much of our imperfect health, and possible also in some of the violence between man and man. But the form in which our harvest comes to us inwardly can be nothing less than a restraint upon our own spiritual evolution. For just as a balloon is prevented from rising so long it is pinned to earth by its cable or the weight of its ballast, so is the soul of man held down by the chain and the ballast which continues the demands of his own lower nature. This aspect of the relationship between man and the animals is one which requires more thought, perhaps, than some of the more obvious aspects, but I believe it is one of the most serious of all the varying results of living according to the doctrine of exploitation. We tend to forget, for example, that one of the most stringent tests of the character of man, and hence his ability to rise higher, is how he behaves to those over whom he possesses power. When he meets the world of animals, he comes up against this test in its most acid form, for it will not be denied that animals cannot successfully resist his will. Instead of living towards them with love and understanding, which one would expect from a compassionate heart and an enlightened mind, he lives towards them as an overlord, in many instances as a parasite, as often he is the cause of considerable suffering to them. All of this arises because he begins by assuming the moral right of exploitation. There lies the crux of the whole matter, and there too lies the only place at which we may, if we will, effect a reconciliation. Until we do effect such a reconciliation, we shall go on reaping what we sow. Until we learn that the fruit of human happiness cannot grow upon the tree of exploitation, so long will the pain and suffering which we inflict upon our lesser brethren return like boomerangs upon our own heads. So much for the first and majority view, the view that we have the right to use animals for our own ends. The second view, as I earlier remarked, is to regard animals as creatures of love. Now, it seems to me to be self-evident that when we love, we do not exploit. In the moment of love, there can be no thought of exploiting that which we love. It also seems to me to be self-evident that love is free. No one can force love. No one can bind it with restrictive covenants. Love and freedom go hand in hand. If, therefore, we accept in principle that it is better to love than to exploit, if, stumble and fail at various points as we may, we still believe it is better to keep our eyes on the goal of love, what then should we do about the animals? Surely the answer is clarity itself. Set them free. And that is precisely what veganism wants to do. It wants to set the animals free, free from exploitation by man, just as in the last century Lincoln, Wilberforce, and the other pioneers sought to set free the human slaves. Veganism is essentially a doctrine of freedom. It seeks to free the animals from bondage to man, and man from bondage to a false belief, the false belief that he has the moral right to use animals for his own ends. It is, of course, a proper question, after we have decided what is right in principle, to ask how such freedom may be brought about. Clearly, the changeover from the practices which arise from exploitation to those which would arise from love would be an enormous undertaking. One has only to think for a moment of the immense ramifications of animal exploitation, and it becomes evident at once that the changeover can come only in stages. We must take the most urgent steps first, and the others gradually as we come to them in order of urgency. One of the first steps is to develop alternatives to those products of animal origin which most men believe to be necessary for their well-being. That is why, at the present time, the emphasis in the vegan movement is upon food and commodities. Here's where we may see the relationship between the vegan and the vegetarian. For the vegan diet is one which does not rest in any way upon exploiting animals. In other words, it is vegetarian in the strictest possible sense, excluding egg and dairy produce as well as flesh. The vegetarian diet, in this strict sense, is one of the many practices which flow from the vegan principle. But, as I have indicated, veganism is a general principle which, if adopted, would result in many changes as well as changes in diet. It would, for example, result in the abolition of vivisection, of hunting, and all other forms of exploiting animals. And while we are agreed that in practice it can be adopted only gradually, nevertheless there is one thing that can be done now and all the time. The spreading of the belief that animal emancipation is not merely a worthwhile cause, but one which cannot be indefinitely postponed. This belief must seem as revolutionary to the present generation as did the emancipation of the human slaves to an earlier generation. But revolutionary or not, I believe that ultimately it is inevitable, that is, if we are ever to live truly in peace upon the earth. For surely it is, to say the least, illogical to pray to a heavenly Father for peace and goodwill among men, and at the same time to conduct an unholy war against our lesser brethren. Hitherto, the idea that we have a moral right to exploit animals has been almost universally accepted. But part of the upward progress of man depends on his ability to see the false in that which has hitherto been regarded as true. For when we see the false as false, then it drops away from us, and other bondage is gone. It is the true, not the false, which liberates. The false cannot lead to freedom, it cannot lead to love. For this reason alone, it seems to me, this young movement, whose goal it is to set the animals free, has its feet upon a true, if long and arduous road. Once again, the links to all of these are in the description of the video. My hope is that by providing an audio version of these resources, more people can become educated about veganism and ending animal use and exploitation. Please make sure to share this video with anyone you think could learn from it. If there are any other important works like this that you think would be helpful for me to read out loud, please let me know in the comments. Thank you to Nathan Schneider of candidhominid.com for creating the PDF versions. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.